welcome to the podcast. I'm joined by my guest, Anne-Marie Christian, who is an international expert on child and adult safeguarding, having provided safeguarding training to professionals in North America, the UK, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and Asia, to name a few places. Anne-Marie brings a wealth of experience to the show. Anne-Marie, welcome.
Thank you, Darren, for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our discussion this afternoon.
Great. Thank you for joining us and giving up some of your time so generously. I really want to dive straight in. So we're talking about safeguarding today. When we say safeguarding, in very plain terms, what do we mean by that?
Okay, so we talk about safeguarding of people, and we might mean children or adults in this conversation. So when we talk about safeguarding, ultimately we're talking about keeping a person safe from harm. So harm being potential harmful things of a behaviour or something happening to them. So categories are normally physical harm, emotional harm, neglectful harm, or sexual harm. And we call those harms then abuse. So when we know it's happened, then we will call it abusive. Our challenge, Darren, is obviously people, human beings, are affected by this in lots of ways. As children, as adults, as parents, as anyone. And themselves might have their own things going on. Like, I know internationally, I always say that child abuse in the concept of a child does not discriminate, meaning every country I've been to that you just read there, I've been invited to be there and talk about, educate staff, children, parents, about raising the awareness of child abuse. So safeguarding, child protection, child abuse, they're all conversations where ultimately we are raising the awareness to prevent it from happening, to encourage reporting. So we learn of who are these people that are causing the harm. They could be family members, relatives, they could be family friends, they could be child friends. So we call it child and child abuse in the sense of peer and peer abuse of a child harming a child. So we have to be really proactive in understanding it can happen by anyone to anyone.
That's great. Thank you.
And also, it could be done deliberately or not. So internationally, there are some practices that we call harmful practices. So, for example, FGM, female genital mutilation, is harmful practice, illegal in every country, but we know it still happens. We know chastisement is illegal in lots of countries, but in some countries it's still not illegal. So that's an example of, in some countries, they are very, very proactive as a government in promoting a approach to keeping lots of children safe. In some countries, it's very reactive. When a child has been hurt, you tell them, but there's no effort to raise the awareness or to educate children, parents, and staff around it. So a lot of countries that are doing it well teach safeguarding for the curriculum. A lot of countries doing it well would raise the awareness to parents about online safety. Do you understand? So yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for touching on the role of parents and educating parents, because one of our audiences are parents listening to this. So I think we can get into that question then. So I know you're a parent yourself, so you understand the challenges of keeping children and young people safe, particularly in this 21st century context. If you had to give parents some advice on some of the main things to be aware of with their children when it comes to safeguarding, what would it be? Maybe you could sort of give your top three, really.
Okay. So first one would be parenting. So with parenting, it's being patient and understanding about child development. So I'm very fortunate to be in a career where it actually adds value to my parenting skills. So And also, I'm quite fortunate that I grew up in a household where I was safe, if that makes sense. So you have to appreciate some people listening as parents didn't have the opportunity and then don't know what to do, or continuing that cycle of abuse to their own children. So I appreciate that. But in saying that, I would say parenting first. So being patient, understanding child development is key, from the newborn baby to the 1-year-old to the 2-year-old, to them exploring their own world, to understanding the confidence and the self-esteem of a child. And why I say that is internationally, I find some cultures and countries they don't understand play, and therefore play is a bad thing, and it's silly, and it's soft and wooey, rather than learning and learning how to talk and learning how to write and to read is much more important. So the 3-year-old who can't read and write, that's what we expect from a child, because they're still exploring their sensory, their 5 senses that they've got. But also, they need to play in order to learn, because they need to understand turn-taking, making mistakes, exploring different textures, and having that world to then focus on learning. So going back to your question, parenting is definitely one of them. And also, when your child makes a mistake, that's part of being a child. It doesn't mean you're going to hit them or tell them off. So you can correct a child without making them feel sad. Okay, so that's one thing really and also identity is important. So your child should have a good sense of their culture, their values, their family disciplines, etc., and not be embarrassed by that. So that's something, again, I took seriously when my child, I've got 2 daughters, and I was aware in the country I'm in the UK, there was no books that represented young black children. So I had to go out and explore and find. And I was so glad when she was 3, she said, "Mummy, that's me in the book." And I said, "Yes, it's you," because she could see a brown child like herself. So if you're a parent from a culture or religion or a particular value that you want your child to be surrounded and see it in resources, you have to find that yourself and not rely on the school to do that for you. The second thing I will say would be their friendship groups and play dates. So again, your child will be asked to go on play dates, but it might be with family relatives too. It might be having a sleepover with their cousin. So we just got to be mindful of, again, anything to do with your child, they could be subject to harm by anyone they know. So including our family, including their family friends, including anyone. So be open-minded rather than I trust these people. And internationally, what I tend to see is people trust their own rather than the outside people. So we've got our own biases about others, and therefore are more likely to trust someone who looks like me, sounds like me, and maybe comes from my country of origin, which is completely irrelevant, but some cultures really believe that. So again, I would introduce to parents, when your child's on a play date, for example, do we know who's in that household? Do we trust and know that family? Even our own relatives. So there's always got to be something where that conversation is being had around their private parts, naming it. The sooner we name them the correct name, the sooner the child can safeguard themselves. Knowing about kissing, for example. When we say go and kiss your granddad or your aunt, you're forcing your child to kiss someone else. Yeah, and they don't want to. But at the same time, stop and think. And then think, what can I do to get out of this? So by introducing them to their feelings, so I did it with my younger daughter. When she used to say, "Mummy, I've got that feeling in my stomach again." I said, "Okay, that's good. What's going on?" And then we talk about it. It could be because she's got to meet her friend tomorrow in school and the friend says something horrible to her, or she might have a test. So it's really important that, we introduce children to what does nervous feel like for us when our body is telling us something doesn't feel right, and having that communication. It could be she just wanted to go to the toilet. It could be anything. And the third one, definitely in 2023, would be online safety. So parents understanding, what their children are doing on their phones. So I personally say that phones should be charged downstairs, not in the child's bedroom. I was doing some work earlier on today when we were looking at the Internet Watch Foundation and the increase of children who have been removed from online platforms, where images were completely abusive. And there's young as 7 and 10, even 6. So we just got to be mindful of, it happens a lot in children's homes, in their bedrooms. Parent thinks they're sensible, or they're just playing a game on their computer. So online safety, having those right parental guidance platforms where you can go on the app and then manage how the child uses it in a private way. So online safety, so if you're a parent and you don't know what your child is viewing or using, you need to have that conversation. You also need to have access to your child's phone at any time because you pay the bill and it's not a toy. So the sooner your child knows parents are watching me, the sooner they'll be reflective on, what I can and cannot do. So that's another thing. Go to your school and let them give you advice on how you can manage your child's activities on their mobile phones.
That's great. So what I'm hearing there, top 3 things would be: number 1, parenting, conscious parenting, really thinking about how you're communicating with your children. Number 2 would be vigilance and boundaries, knowing who's around your child.
Trust.
And who you can trust, and also having question marks about that as well. And as you said, having an open mind, being conscious of certain biases we may have. And I really liked what you said around boundaries and getting the young people to think about their own boundaries. Oh, that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable there. And if it does, you have the right to assert your own boundaries. I think that's hugely powerful. And finally, the third one was online safety, which I think, most parents are either angsty about or certainly trying to get to grips with now that, young people have these powerful devices in their pocket and access to so much information. So I really appreciate you giving us the top 3 there. Very helpful.
And to be frank, actually on that, Darren, we've got to think about the reality of when people say to me, I've been qualified social worker for 27 years. So when people say to me, what's changed in 27 years in my day job, safeguarding? I say the internet, where children are more accessible to those people who pose a risk to children. Full stop. So if you don't know about online, please, as a parent, it's another platform where children are accessible to people who want to harm them. The old-fashioned use phrase, the sheep in wolves, no, the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's a classic. And that's what these people do. There's AIs now they could use to filter their faces. There's lots of apps. There could be animations. So we really have to. And every year or even every month, I get an increase of new devices, new apps, new ways that they're using. So please, yes, it's a lovely place to phone. They can talk to their friends. They can have FaceTime and do dancing. But also, in my job, we're getting increasing referrals of child abuse online.
Great. Thank you very much. So just shifting tone slightly, what are some of the main themes that you're seeing emerge in the current landscape of child safeguarding? I know you mentioned about technology, but particularly in international schools, really.
Okay, so it's interesting. Terminologies are things that change around the world. So I've seen things, Anne-Marie, we've got lots of bullying in our school. When I've gone to that country or gone and investigated further, it's actually sexual violence and harassment. So it's been sexual assault on children, boys and girls. Or it's been racism. So we've got a lot of bullying. It's racial bullying or religious bullying. So when we use the word bullying, we've got to be mindful of, if we say in the UK, so just so you know, in England, we are one of the countries where we've got a very proactive approach from our government as well in how we safeguard. In some countries, they're very reactive, but we're very proactive. So a lot of international countries kind of look at us as good practice and try to embed some of those practices. So it's important that child on child is a big thing. Going back to some people call it bullying, but it's actually harmful behaviours done to others by a child, normally someone they know or befriended them, hence they know them. That's a big theme that I'm seeing growing over the years. And also online that we mentioned. Internationally, again, identity-based harm. So someone who's been bullied or discriminated against or prejudices against them. So the child who's been picked on because they wear a turban or a hijab or they've got afro hair or they got an accent. You understand? So there's loads of reasons. And again, we call it identity or identity-based harm is what I'm hearing it called internationally. And let's be honest, a lot of our international schools have got third culture children. So because of that, they're going to have layers. So I've interviewed children in some of our international schools who might be a word I've learned called Asian, white and Asian. But because they look more white passing in that sense, their identity's been neglected in the sense of people don't really recognise them as that other culture. Does that make sense? So they're being bullied around things when they don't realise they've got another culture to them in the sense of harmful things being done. So there's kind of themes again of, you know, generally just fighting the things of grooming. But the themes I definitely would say also the increase of domestic abuse. So we've seen the impact of COVID. Mental health is a big thing that I'm getting a lot at the moment. Suicide, thoughts, anxieties. We've got to think of some countries, there are, to think of suicide is actually illegal, hence the word commit suicide, right? So in some countries internationally, we know that those schools are struggling with informing the authorities because that child might be hospitalised or put in prison. You know, or the police force won't see it as a supportive thing. So there are lots of, and also another thing we see in the international challenges are in lots of countries, heterosexual relationships are promoted and homosexual relationships are not. Does that make sense? In the illegal sense. So schools where they have children who are questioning their identity, their gender or their sexuality are very limited in what they can do to support that child's well-being. So going back to well-being and welfare of the child, that's really important before learning. So children have to feel comfortable in themselves.
That's great that you touched on that, actually, because one of the things I wanted you to explore was this aspect of mental health. And how do we see, or what do you think is the right way to see mental health and well-being in the context of safeguarding as opposed to just a separate issue?
Okay, so there's lots of labels going around, hence well-being is a word we've introduced out of the word welfare of the child, because the well-being of the child has to be stable and positive in order. So internationally, I say welfare, inclusion, and attendance. So welfare, attendance, and learning. That's my international one. So those three are really important. So in order to get the best for the child to learn, we need to include and understand their welfare. We need full attendance too. So welfare, attendance, and learning are the three international ones. So with that in mind, going back to your question, we need that child to feel confident that they tried and they did well. They could have done better, but they tried, rather than that's terrible what you've done. So parents, you know, when you don't praise your children enough, it could mean actually you are slowly stripping your child's confidence. Or internationally, I see over-educating children. They've got tutors, they've got Saturday school. They have no play. They have no escape from learning. So their brain is frazzled and they need some downtime. So that also can impact on the nervousness or anxieties of children. So we find in some cultures there is lots of children with anxieties. And when they go to a country where they recognise anxiety, they feel comfortable to finally say, I'm not coping. And it's not a bad thing not coping, because we know you're a child. Compared to children who haven't got that expression to say that they're not doing well because they're in fear of the consequence of it. So welfare and well-being are the introductions to mental health. And mental health isn't a bad thing. So I know internationally it's frowned upon, like there's something wrong with my child, or some cultures or religions might see it as a sin, you know, because you're not praying enough. That's why these bad thoughts are in your head. So we have to understand the teenage brain. We have to understand the impact of COVID since 2020. Lots of things, you know, the pressure they see on social media, all that nonsense they see that they then feel not good enough, not beautiful enough, not tall enough, all those things, boys and girls. So most settings I work with, and I work with international, education, faith, sports, arts, you know, different sectors, they are all facing that same mental health crisis. And we know if you're non-paying school, then you could access the the public sector NHS or internationally health service. If you're fee paying, then you might have a doctor on site or the nurse or the health medical centres, but also you might have private practice anyway. So we've just got to be mindful of some of our international affluent families might be accessing private care but not telling you because they're in fear of the stigma attached, or not activating it because they're in fear of the child being labelled.
I'm really appreciative of you touching on that, actually. And you mentioned affluence and, working in the private sector where students may come from fairly affluent backgrounds. I was wondering if you could explain for our listeners what this term affluent neglect is and maybe some of the impact of children suffering from affluent neglect.
So I first heard about it from an amazing professor called Professor Claudia Bernard in 2018. And I'm very fortunate in my network to actually know her as well. I've met her on various occasions and I've spoken to her about her research. She's done further research also about the impact it has on safeguarding needs, but that's another conversation. But affluent neglect is about, she was saying in her research that when she spoke to professionals, particularly social workers, she found that when they got involved in lots of cases with affluent families, there were certain barriers and blockages. So it's a hidden form because people normally think of neglect as poorer people who can't afford this or they're not doing that because of that. When actually, affluent neglect is the opposite. These children have everything they want, i.e. materialistic things, good school, fee paying, they've got a driver, they've got the helpers, everything else. But there's a disconnect between them and their parents. So they might have paid carers. There's a sense of entitlement because their family's wealthy with status. There's an element of how dare you say that about my child. So when we as professionals try to engage, sometimes the external stuff we see, we think, oh, they must be lovely because they've got a nice house and they're caring. When actually, sometimes we've learned through the research, they're better at hiding it. So sometimes they're non-compliant because I don't have to tell you about the private hospital appointments. We know that they're sometimes very good at kind of challenging your practice. So there's lots of themes where professionals sat on the fence and didn't make decisions because they were intimidated by some of the coming from them. So sometimes we find they will hide substance misuse more. Yeah, so they might go to a private clinic to recover from rehab, or domestic abuse will be there, but it'll be financial abuse. So we're saying there's the same abuse going on, but it looks different because they're wealthy. Do you understand? So it could be domestic abuse, it could be control, it could be they've been hit, but it's something where the child is less likely to tell someone because of the consequence of outing the family. So it's a good read. She's if you Google it, you'll see it. It's from the University of Goldsmiths in London. And it's Professor Claudia Bernard. So it's looking at, again, some of our parents being unrealistic about their children. So expecting, because you're paying for education, you're expecting your child to be perfect. Not praising your child a lot, not spending quality time with your child. So you provide all the basic care and everything, but you're not stimulating your child on your own. Someone else is doing the parenting for you. So there were lots of themes that came up. Sometimes with the older children, they're more trusting. So what I find a lot in our international schools in various continents I've been to is the parent will go abroad and let the child, especially teenage kids, have a play day, or they'll go to an Airbnb or they'll go to a hotel and stay there for the week with their friends. So their friends are babysitting them. The parents pay for all of it, even in some countries, yachts. Yeah? And then in that, they're having a good time. They might check in with the kid every now and then or not. But the reality is that there's nothing about the kid taking, risky behaviours. And what we then find is there is alcohol poisoning. There is sexual violence and harassment. No one's supervising these children. So that's the thing I see quite a lot is parents outside the country, leaving their children in the country or working long hours or just on business trips, but not, again, thinking about what's happening for that child. If that makes sense. So that's what I mean. And if you read up on it, there's so much more to learn. But I do love that new research. And then she interviewed safeguarding leads and found the same in schools. Same where when you contact that family to have a conversation, there's a kind of reaction you get, which is again accusing you more than anything else.
That's great. Thank you very much. For our listeners, that's Professor Claudia Bernard. Claudia, yes. Claudia Bernard.
I'm speaking at an event with her on Saturday.
Okay.
I share the stage with her. She's a lovely person.
Hopefully it's recorded and we can get access to that. That would be great. Thank you very much. And it sort of feeds into one of your earlier points, and you were listing some of the top 3 priorities for parents and how they can support with the safeguarding and welfare and adequate development of their children. This idea of parenting properly, that's kind of where it starts. So
definitely,
thank you for that. Just coming on to our last question now. You're certainly familiar with the phrase, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. So how can teachers play an active role in safeguarding students in their care?
Okay. So firstly, you're starting off with regular training. So in my job, I have to really make an effort to be updated, because obviously it's my day job and I'm advising and consulting lots of people and training. So for staff, you should have training at least annual. I say at least half a day session in one chunk, face to face, and it should be local to the context in your setting. Secondly, I'd say throughout the year, every term, also gone further training. Again, it could be online or just instead do another half hour or hour. And again, be aware of the latest trends, being, like toilets are a hotspot for, and changing rooms for child and child abuse. Being aware that you're going to hear a lot of things that happen outside the school that will bring into the school, sleepovers, etc. So we've just got to be really vigilant and aware that children find it difficult to tell us, and our remit is to be the person they choose to tell. So let's tune into our children and don't use the word attention seeking. Let's say they're attention needing. Why is this child acting this way? Be mindful of, a lot of children have experienced things that they don't realise is problematic until they then grow up and reflect on, oh my gosh, that was abusive. So that's a classic we see for sexual harm, for example. When they have their own relationships with adults, they then look back to think, whoa, that means when I was only 7 or 12, I now know that was wrong. In some cultures internationally, no one talks about body parts. So it's very hard for a child. I've interviewed children who have been subject to harm where mum didn't believe this was happening. And then this person was sent away for telling lies on this person. And then had to go to someone where someone believed them. And that was, we've got to think about culturally, what does that look like for that child who's got all those barriers, meaning no one's ever spoke to them about it before. And then they've got to tell someone in the house about who's doing it. Will they believe them or dismiss them? And they're powerless in it, these kids, because they can't run away from home, can they? Yeah? So they could tell school, are they going to get the person in trouble? They're in fear of it happening again. So there's so many things to be aware of. And I do feel that in schools, you're best placed to pick up on those children. There's quiet children, there's rowdy children. It doesn't matter. They're children who might be trying to communicate through behaviour, expression, art, story, music, whatever. But we've just got to be really aware. So the sooner we become approachable and connect with the children around us, the sooner that child's more likely to tell us.
That's great. And that's a great place to end, with a little nugget for our listeners there, particularly our teachers, about creating those safe spaces where we can become approachable, and this idea of tuning in to what young people are talking about and some of the things they may be facing. So I'd like to thank you once again for your time and all of your expertise. I'm sure our listeners will take away a lot of value from this podcast about safeguarding. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Darren. Appreciate that.